5 myths about healing and why they keep you stuck. One of the reasons so many people stay stuck emotionally is because they misunderstand what healing actually is. They've absorbed ideas from culture, social media, therapy language, even spirituality and self-help books, and from wounded people online who are still deeply identified with their suffering. And because of that, many people unknowingly adopt beliefs about healing that actually prevent the healing. They start assuming that healing is supposed to be endlessly complicated, it's endlessly painful and never ending. And those beliefs actually shape their experience. Because if you believe healing takes forever, you will move through life expecting to stay broken. If you believe you'll always carry the pain, you stop looking for actual freedom. If you believe the triggers you have are permanent, you continue organizing your life around emotional fear and avoidance. So in this video, I want to break down some of the biggest myths about healing and explain why they keep so many people psychologically trapped. Myth number 1, healing needs to take a long time. One of the biggest myths in modern psychology and healing culture is the belief that healing inherently takes years or decades. Now, to be clear, some people do remain stuck for years, but that does not mean that healing itself naturally requires years. Most prolonged suffering is not caused by emotions or even events themselves. It's caused by resistance to emotions. Avoidance, suppression, distraction, intellectualizing, control, fear of feeling. That is what prolongs suffering. You see, human beings can process enormous amounts of emotional pain surprisingly quickly once they stop resisting it. You see, the nervous system is actually designed to process emotion, but most people interrupt the process constantly. The moment grief arises, they distract themselves. The moment fear bubbles up, they seek reassurance. The moment shame arises, they defend themselves. The moment they feel pain, they numb, they analyze, scroll, work, or avoid it. And then they conclude, healing takes forever. No, resistance takes forever. What takes years is avoiding truth while trying not to feel. But the moment someone becomes fully willing to face truth, however painful, however difficult, and they consciously feel the pain without resistance, healing often accelerates dramatically. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because the emotional energy finally is allowed to move. Myth number 2, you're never fully healed. Another massive myth is the belief that you are never fully healed and you will always carry the pain forever. This belief has become incredibly normalized. People say things like, you never really heal, you just learn to live with it. The pain never leaves. And while those statements may feel emotionally profound, they often become self-fulfilling prophecies. Because what people are describing is not healed pain. They're describing unresolved pain that continues getting psychologically reactivated. And there's a huge difference. Now, does life still happen after healing? Of course. Can you still remember painful experiences? Absolutely. But memory is not the same thing as suffering. You can remember something without having to emotionally relive it every time. And real healing is absolutely possible, which means freedom from pain is possible. There are people who have gone through betrayal, abuse, trauma, rejection, heartbreak, addiction, anxiety, and grief who no longer suffer from those experiences constantly. But the question is why? Because the emotional charge dissolved. The ego stopped identifying with the pain, and the nervous system stopped resisting reality. You see, what keeps people stuck is not the original pain itself. It's the attachment to the identity built around the pain. Myth number 3, time heals all wounds. This is one of the most repeated myths of all. Time heals all wounds. Time by itself heals nothing. If time healed wounds automatically, then everyone would be more peaceful, more conscious, and more emotionally healthy. They'd get more free as they aged. But that's obviously not true. Some people remain bitter and angry for 40 years. Some people hold on to their pain for decades, even on their deathbed. Some people remain emotionally trapped in childhood wounds their entire lives, even though the event happened 30 years in the past. Well, why? Because time obviously does not heal. What does heal is conscious processing of the pain. Time simply gives people more opportunity to either heal or continue reinforcing their suffering. In fact, many people don't process pain over time. They actually rehearse it over time. They replay the story, they replay the resentment, they replay betrayal and anger, and the very repetition of that process strengthens the emotional pattern. So people think they're processing, but what they're often doing is recycling. But true healing happens when truth is faced consciously and emotions are fully allowed to process, not simply because a certain amount of time has passed. Myth number 4, understanding your pain intellectually is the same as healing emotionally. This is an enormous trap, especially for intelligent people. Many people become incredibly knowledgeable about psychology and trauma and attachment styles, narcissism, nervous systems, these woo-woo terms like shadow work and spirituality, emotional patterns. They can explain their childhood perfectly. They can explain their triggers perfectly. They can explain why they are the way they are perfectly. But they're still deeply suffering. Why? The obvious answer is because intellectual understanding is not the same as emotional resolution. You can understand your trauma intellectually while still resisting the emotions underneath it completely. This is why some people spend years analyzing themselves without actually healing. They're thinking about their feelings instead of simply feeling them without resistance. And thinking always creates emotional distance. Analysis, as strange as it sounds, often becomes another protection mechanism. It's another way to avoid vulnerability, another way to avoid surrender. The mind, it wants to solve emotions conceptually because actually feeling them feels dangerous to the ego. But healing is not primarily intellectual. Healing is emotional, it's somatic, it's experiential. And it happens when the body and the nervous system finally stop resisting reality and suppressed emotions are allowed to move consciously. Myth number 5, you will always live with triggers. This myth keeps people imprisoned in fear. People start believing, this trigger will always control me. I will always react this way. This wound is permanent. But triggers are not permanent identities. Triggers are unresolved emotional material. A trigger simply reveals where an emotional charge still exists within you. That's all. A trigger in and of itself is not the problem. It's the emotional bomb that it sets off within you. So if you touch a wound and it hurts, the pain does not mean the wound is your identity forever. It means healing is still incomplete. And what's important to understand is that triggers lose their power as the emotional resistance dissolves. This is why fully healed people often encounter situations that once devastated them, and they feel almost nothing. Not because they became numb, not because they stopped caring, but because the unresolved emotional charge no longer exists. The ego is no longer protecting the wound. Most people normalize living triggered because they've never fully processed the underlying pain. So instead, they organize their life around avoiding triggers. They avoid certain conversations. They avoid intimacy, vulnerability, rejection, and uncertainty, but avoidance strengthens the fear, whereas healing dissolves the fear. And eventually, the nervous system realizes this situation is no longer dangerous. That is real freedom. The ego secretly loves these myths. What's fascinating is that all of these myths are actually very clever ways the ego holds on to pain as a protection. Because if healing is truly possible, if freedom is truly possible, then eventually you would have to let the pain go. And that terrifies the ego. Because pain is protection. The ego uses suffering as armor, as identity, as justification, a shield against vulnerability. So if you continue believing that healing takes forever, you never fully have to surrender and let your guard down. If you believe you'll always carry the pain, you never have to fully open your heart again. If you believe triggers are permanent, you can continue controlling life to avoid discomfort. If you believe intellectual understanding is healing, you never actually have to feel vulnerable emotions fully. Can you see how crafty the ego is? It creates endless reasons why you can't let go, why you can't trust again, why you can't soften, why you can't become vulnerable and exposed again. Because vulnerability feels dangerous to the ego. But here's the paradox. The very thing the ego fears most is always the doorway to freedom. Because freedom requires openness. It requires surrender. It requires the willingness to feel, the willing to risk pain again, and the willingness to stop protecting yourself from life. The ego says, if I let go of this pain, I'll get hurt again. But holding on to the pain is already hurting you. And eventually people realize something very profound. The attempt to protect themselves from pain became the source of their suffering. All of these myths share one thing in common. They subtly teach people that suffering is permanent, that healing is endlessly complicated, endlessly incomplete, and endlessly out of reach. And the ego loves those beliefs because they preserve identity. If healing takes forever, the ego never has to fully surrender. If pain is permanent, the ego gets to keep identifying with suffering. If triggers are permanent, the ego gets to continue controlling life to avoid discomfort. But healing becomes truly possible the moment someone stops worshiping their wounds and they start becoming willing to fully face the truth. Healing is much simpler than most people think. Healing is simply the dissolution of resistance, the willingness to feel pain without judgment or resistance. Willingness to face truth honestly, however painful or ugly it is. Feel your emotions consciously. Stop avoiding reality. Stop protecting your ego. Stop organizing your life around the fear of pain. And if you do that, something very profound will happen. The feelings that you feared the most lose power over you. Not because you controlled life perfectly, but because you no longer fear that feeling. That's freedom. So if you feel stuck, ask yourself honestly, what beliefs about healing have I unconsciously adopted that keep me identified with suffering? Because many people are not trapped by pain itself. They're trapped by the stories they've been taught about pain. And those stories, once they dissolve, healing becomes much more natural than most people can ever imagine.